Hello everyone, welcome to Hill Street. Today's story is I've Seen the Soulkeeper. If you end up enjoying this story, please leave a like. If you enjoy hearing stories from me, please subscribe, become a resident. Let me know how I'm doing in the comments. Now, let's get to this nightmare. I've been somewhere and learned many things that no living person should know. I don't know what that means for me, and I don't know how much longer I have left after exposing these things. But I can't die as the only holder of this information. The world as we know it, and the concept of souls and human autonomy is a complete farce. I didn't wake up today with a hunger for adventure. In fact, I didn't wake up with any other thought than, I can't wait to go back to bed tonight. It was like any other day. I had to work even on the weekends, so I got up, got ready for work, and headed into the office. When I pulled into the parking lot, nothing looked out of place. I even noticed my coworker's car sitting there in the lot, waiting for me to join them inside already. With a deep breath, I got out of the car and lumbered to the door. When I got there though, I noticed that the door was still locked. That wasn't normal. Whoever gets to the office first opens the door and leaves it unlocked for the rest of us to arrive in the morning. But maybe one of my female coworkers was nervous about being there alone. So I pulled out my office key, unlocked the door, and pushed it open. Pushing the door open, I felt my heart drop into my stomach. The lights were still off, and it was eerily still inside. I know I saw my coworker's car there, so where was everyone? Why would the lights still be off if they were already inside? I knew logically that my coworkers were not inside of the building. I knew that this was out of the ordinary. But my body was stuck on autopilot and marched inside of the building anyways. Immediately upon entering and stepping foot into the dark hallway leading to the slew of offices and cubicles, I could smell a stale, sort of mildew smell. It was almost sour, the same smell you get after running a load of laundry and forgetting about it in the washer for a few days. As I continued walking, I noticed that the hallway to get to my office seemed longer than usual. I figured it was probably just my reluctance to start working, so I brushed it off. Eventually, reaching my door, the shades were pulled over the windows, probably from the overnight cleaning crew, so I opened the door and entered with a sigh. Except, when I did enter, I didn't enter my office. Spread before me was a large stadium-esque room. I was on the very top of this stadium, looking down into the rows and rows of seats concentrated around an oblong-shaped floor in the middle. As I staggered back to catch myself out of fear of falling and a fear of heights, I regulated my breathing and looked down once again. Each and every seat in this stadium was filled. This was not a small room by any means. It reminded me of basketball stadiums packed to the brim with people, except in this case, while all the seats were full, not a single person was moving. Everyone seated in the audience was perfectly and completely still. The absence of movement is what drew my eye to the center of the floor in the middle. The main attraction, the person that everyone in the seats were focused around, was a very old man. This man had closely cropped white hair, a thin and wispy beard that went well beyond his shoulders, a large white doctor's coat, and dark black goggles framing his face. He looked like a scientist about to partake in a dangerous experiment, and he had covered all important places of his body with extra protection. He was also seated in some sort of moving contraption. Centered in the floor, there was a large mechanic base with a singular arm that reached up and had the capability to bend at 12 different sections. Located at the top of the arm was a seat holding the scientist. The machine allowed the man to control where he went with a series of levers and also allowing for a full 360-degree access. And by the length of the mechanistic arm, he could also reach up all the way to where I was. Dropping to my knees to avoid being seen, I continued to watch this scientist as he whirred across the stadium, swirling almost in circles, grabbing different items from tables strewn around the mechanical base of his chair. After he picked up 3 different smaller bottles, he poured them all into a beaker, and without even a noise, signaling a chemical reaction, green smoke started to pour out of the beaker with a strange intensity. "Aha!" exclaimed the scientist. "The soul." With that, he pressed a button up on his chair near the movement levers, and another large arm extended out from the bleachers. It looked like where a team would enter the stadium after exiting the locker rooms. It extended diagonally and upwards, revealing underneath it hundreds upon hundreds of large cards, connected all to the arm at the top. The arm had finally extended completely and shuddered to a stop, all of the cards swinging in the sudden loss of forward momentum. With a hum, the scientist stepped forward and plucked a single card out of the lineup. "Marshall, you are up once more," he said. He threw a large card up into the air directly in the middle of the stadium, his head tilting back with the force of his throw. It flew up into the air and landed, seemingly suspended in the middle of the open space above the scientist. Spinning horizontally, the card waited expectantly for whatever might happen next. Looking at it, I could see a portrait photo of a man, printed clearly on the front. It displayed his first and last name with a portrait underneath. I looked at the card, the smiling face of a man staring back at me. The scientist extended his chair upward again to meet the car in midair. He simply said, "Come," and I looked around, curious as to what he was summoning. Suddenly, one of the bleacher seats in the stadium began to click and whir, moving forward and up on another mechanical arm to meet both the scientist and the name card in the middle of the stadium's airspace. The man seated on the moving chair, being extended towards the scientist with a beaker full of green smoke, was the same man whose face was displayed on the card. The card being thrown into midair had summoned its namesake from the still deadly still audience. Assuming this was Marshall, he also was deadly still. His eyes had no sparkle behind them at all, and his mouth was slack-jawed. His skin lacked any sort of color, and it was almost like he was a corpse seated in a stadium's bleacher seat. As Marshall reached both the scientist and the name card with his photo on it, the chair jerked to a stop, nearly throwing Marshall out of it. He still made no reaction and merely slumped forward in his chair. The scientist plucked his head back, keeping him upright, and took a singular finger and tapped it on his forehead twice. With this motion, Marshall's entire head split open. There was no gore. There wasn't even a hint of any sort of blood. It was as if his body was completely empty. His head just completely split open, revealing the absence of anything underneath. The line cut his forehead directly in half, and both sides opened horizontally to expose where a brain should be. However, there was absolutely nothing inside of his head, a fact that I still can't even begin to wrap my mind around. The scientist's beaker, full of billowing green smoke still clutched in his left hand, began to lift the beaker towards Marshall. Once he hovered the beaker over the gaping hole in this man's head, he tilted downward and began to pour. The thick, green smoke that emanated out of the beaker followed the pouring motion and situated itself firmly inside of this man's open head. There were wisps of green smoke escaping as the scientist tapped his forehead again, and both sides of his head began to close around the newly formed green matter of Marshall's head. As I heard the two halves of his head audibly click back into place, the scientist clasped both his hands underneath his chin and sat forward, excitedly awaiting something that was about to happen. And that's when the corpse that was sitting in the mechanical chair began to cough. He coughed so forcefully and suddenly that I was almost knocked back, but managed to keep myself steady. He coughed twice forcefully, and each time a plume of green smoke escaped through both his mouth and his nose. "Welcome back," the scientist cooed to Marshall, and looking upon him with a smile, he finished with, "It's time again." Marshall, still seated in the mechanical chair that had risen him up into the middle of the stadium, merely nodded, and the scientist moved a couple of other levers, and his chair began to move once again. The newly animated man began to rise upwards in my direction. As I noticed his trajectory, I scuttled behind the wall of the open door, hoping and praying that I wouldn't be noticed by whoever this was and whatever was about to happen. The chair kept on ascending, eventually stopping directly at the ledge that was my old office door. Marshall casually stepped out of the now stopped chair, stood up, and straightened his clothing. Thankfully, looking nowhere except ahead of him, Marshall promptly walked down the hallway the same way I had come. It was at this point, when he was closer to me, that I noticed that Marshall actually looked familiar. As he turned the corner to open the door to the parking lot at the end of the hallway, I caught a closer glimpse of his face, and that's when I realized, that's my boss. The man I knew as Bill was actually Marshall, and just had an entire beaker worth of mysterious green smoke poured into both halves of his head, and was closed up like a machine. It took all I had not to gasp and draw his attention. With wide eyes, I slapped my hand over my mouth to calm my response, and the door to the parking lot clicked shut. The door that I thought had led to my office clicked shut shortly afterwards, and I was left alone in the dark hallway, struggling to catch my breath before I hyperventilated. Standing up on shaky legs, I made my way down the hallway where Bill or Marshall had just stood, and opened the door to the parking lot. Once I stepped out of the building, everything seemed the same as it was. My car was still sitting where I left it, as were my coworkers' cars. I whirled around to the door I had just walked through and opened it again. Except this time, it led to a brightly lit hallway with coworkers chatting with each other and carrying cups of freshly brewed coffee. The same door somehow had two destinations, and I had a feeling I was not supposed to see that first one. Coming smiley around the corner, Bill walked up to me, said good morning, and quickly asked me for a meeting in his office in 30 minutes. I'm typing this as I sit in my office, preparing for the meeting with something that is most definitely not my boss, and most definitely not human. I need to get this story out in case I don't make it back from that meeting as myself. The end. That was I've Seen the Soulkeeper. If you ended up enjoying this story, please leave a like. I hope you all have had a great day, and have a good night.